All right, welcome everybody to another edition of Tech Chat Tuesdays, a very tough name to say. I am joined today by fellow engineer, senior front engineer Drew DeCarme. How you doing, man?
Good. What's up?
Hey, so I'm Ken Rimple, the host, and we've got a number of interesting things to talk about today, specifically around static site generation as well as server-side rendering of front-end applications. So Drew is one of our experts in that space and in the front end. Specifically, he's done a lot of work with React, some work with Angular, a lot of work with JavaScript, CSS, TypeScript, things like that. So we're glad to have him on the channel. So that's what our topic's going to be today. And then before we start with that, I just want to go through a few little pieces of news. First of all, let me share my screen here. So if you go to youtube.com/Chariot Solutions, you'll see our playlist for this show if you happen to stumble upon it. Also, we are a podcast and you can subscribe to the feed. So for example, if you go to playlists, Tech Chat Tuesdays, I'm not going to play this again, stop. You can subscribe. And click the little bell for reminders. If you're a YouTube person, you've heard that way too many times. But that's a way to get to the live stream. And we've got a lot of good stuff already in the 3 months we've been doing this. So in our Tech Chat Tuesdays, we've had interviews with people like Alex Hillman, who released a book called The Tiny MBA. That was a fun one. We've had discussions on things like outages, breaches, and postmortems and where to find those to learn about what kinds of things fail and how they get resolved. We talked to like virtualized IDEs and development tools, a whole bunch of different things. So feel free to hit that up at youtube.com/Chariot Solutions. You can always visit our blog at chariotsolutions.com/blog and find all sorts of things that we've been talking about in writing.
Some good stuff on there.
Oh yeah, no, I love this blog. We've got interviews, we've got writing, we've got a whole bunch of different things by different technical experts on different technologies. So, for example, you'll see Keith Gregory puts a lot of stuff up on AWS, and so on. So, mobile developers and Java developers and all sorts of different stuff on there. So, feel free to use our resources as much as you can, and we're glad you're here for today's interview. Coming up, news-wise, there is a giant elephant in the room, which is, of course, Apple themselves are going to be announcing their whatever it is today at 1 p.m. Eastern. So someone said recently it was supposed to be like a cheap Apple Watch was one of the things they were going to talk about. And I believe there's something about the word time in the title for the talk, so I'm sure it's about the watch. The Apple Watch is coming out with a new version soon, I would think, based on that. Maybe it's a plasticky one, and supposedly it's $200 cheaper. So my wife might actually get one at this point because she's going to spend that kind of money, and she's a runner. So, and they're talking about potentially an iPad Air. Seems like the talk around the phone is like that's kind of cooled off. They don't think the phone will be ready in time. So anyway, that'll be interesting. And if we have anything to share, I've been using all the betas for iOS 14. So maybe next week we can talk a little bit about that. I'm trying to line up a talk with one of our other people around iOS 14 and iPadOS 14 to have some discussions. So we'll see where that goes.
How's the beta, Ken? Is it nuked everything, or?
I think it's great. So I don't normally get excited about iOS beta because it's always just little tiny tweaks. Yeah. But so here's a real basic thing. Like you get a phone call on iOS and it takes over your whole screen. That's really annoying. Like on Android, usually it's like a little drop down, like here comes a call. It's a little easier for most Android skins. But for iOS, it just takes over. Now in iOS 14, it's just a little tiny thing, but it shows up as a little tiny notification with a hang up and a connect button. And it's just really easy to use. So little stuff like that all the way through the OS. They've really worked on like just making it more usable. The biggest thing really is widgets. So like you now have, and wow, what a surprise. What's a widget? I don't know. Let's think about, I don't know, Android. So basically they caught up with Android and now they have widgets. Easily, right? 5 years ago. So like you could put widgets not only on a widget page, but you can drag them onto the home screen, and they've got quarter and half and middle view versions of those things. So that's useful. You can do things like there's a really good sleep management tool now. So when you go to bed, you can put even like actions. I just saw this on beta 8. You can put shortcuts on that page and say, okay, every time you're on the sleep lock page, add shortcuts to turn off your radios or do whatever you want to do, which is kind of cool. So just a lot of cool stuff like that. So there's stuff to talk about on the iPad. What I really like is the Apple Pencil. You can actually write in handwriting on the screen in fields, and it will fill them in. If I had good handwriting, that'd be great. But
Wow.
so
Yeah,
that's pretty cool.
my partner Heather, she has the iPad Air, like the iPad Pro, the big one,
Oh
and she
yeah,
uses Apple Pencil all the time. She's really into illustration. She's like a fantastic artist,
that's awesome.
and that thing has like saved so much time for her. She loves it, so she'll be stoked about that. I mean,
Oh
I'm
yeah,
I'm like the worst user for Apple because I have like 7 or 8 pages of apps, and all I do is pull the search bar down and just search my app and just select it there. I have no
yep.
idea where any apps are, so
Oh,
maybe
that's another thing.
this update will help.
No, it will because one of the things I don't know if I could do this, but one of the things they have is they've got this app library thing now. I don't know if you can see this here. What a great camera shot, right?
Yeah,
But they
right.
have an auto-organized app library, so they do it by
Whoa.
categories. Yeah, and so and then you can pull any of those off. You can right-click on them and add them, or look at the whole view of those types of applications. Now they set the categories up, so I'm sure that'll be fun for people.
Perfect.
Yeah, so.
It's like trying to find icons that other people named. Is it settings? Is it cog? Is it gear? I don't know.
Exactly. Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see where that goes. So that's that. We also have some upcoming events. So on the Chariot Solutions website, there's an events tab. It's actually under resources events. I know we kind of categorize things to try to keep things in the menus, and I'm sure there's a usability person who would tease us for that. But under resources events, so all this code build we can stomach in 45 minutes. This is my snarky title. No one loves build tools. They're always, you have to get things done in them. And whenever you wade through a new build tool or a build orchestration tool, there's usually just a lot of stuff that's you got to know by doing, right? Or someone sitting down with you and saying, hey, here's how you run the code build locally so that you don't have to submit it 50 times and wait a minute and a half to 5 minutes each time to get an answer because you had a missing comma somewhere. So that's the kind of stuff I'm going to bring up. So we'll have 45 minutes or so of lecture and then question and answer. And that is for Philly Tech Week. So you can go to our events page, chariotsolutions.com/events, and you can hit up that one again, right off of resources events. And then sign up. It's free. It's at 10 a.m. Next Tuesday, the 22nd. Also, we have something coming up that we haven't really put on screen yet, but we're doing a Java at 25 event. We have a special speaker lined up. So look at our Twitter feed at Chariot Solution or on our webpage under events, and you'll check that out soon when that comes out. All right, so that's the main thrust of it. And of course, I'm showing you all this stuff without showing you. I do this every freaking time. Hey,
Nice.
look, everybody. Here's the screen. Wait a minute.
I had it all memorized, so
See, that's good. So there's all the code you can stand, code build you can stand, events, and right there it is. All right. Also, I don't know if this has happened already. Let me see about the product tank. Yeah, that's already over. All right, good. So we'll leave that as it is. Okay, cool. So what we want to talk about today is we want to talk about content-based sites. So Drew, let's talk a little bit about content management on websites, right? So we all started out, dealing with dynamic sites and pulling up data from databases or from different files to render things like a WordPress app or something like that. But for a long time now, people have been generating content-rich sites. Tell me a little bit about how you ran into that, and specifically around Gatsby.
Good question. I mean, I guess I could start. I'll start at the beginning of time. At the
The earth
beginning,
cooled. Oh,
at the beginning of time, there was this thing called WordPress. So heavy PHP. You did a lot of the server and client interactions all within one big package, and then you deployed that as sort of a single entity. Then people realized it was slow, and JavaScript, took off, and everyone was like, "Hey, JavaScript is the greatest thing in the world." And then we had these single-page frameworks. So as far as content goes, content had to shift. So you saw a lot. Or the trend you're seeing now these days is shifting your rendering solution away from your content, right? So you have these content management solutions like Contentful, Prismic. There's like Webiny, all sorts of things like that. So if you were a heavy engineer and you were really into making your own solutions backed by content, that's kind of the stack that you chose. Now there's other solutions out there which people are probably more commonly commonly used to is like Squarespace and Weebly. And those are your site creators. So those have sort of like a monolithic approach to it, and more of like a GUI where you can go up and edit your content and edit your website at the same time. So from WordPress being what it was, there's obviously a massive evolution in how you can build a website or build a content-based marketing site or anything like that. But what I've really seen come to light is the maturation of the frameworks that use some of the headless CMSs. So things like Next, things like Gatsby. You can even go as far as like Vue. I'm not sure if Angular. I don't know if Angular has their own sort of their own tie into that. But pretty much anything that you can use a headless CMS that has an API, you pull data from the API, much like you'd use in a single page application, and then you render your content. Mm-hmm. So from that perspective, it's really tough to keep up with this stuff too, because these things
go so fast. Yeah,
it's like the light of speed, or the speed of light. So kind of where our big ballpark has been is, since we're an engineering consultancy, is what can we do? What are these tools that we can learn to make sure that if there is a different content strategy, rather than us scaling an API, what are the things that we can do on the front end to make sure that we can sort of fit into that, right? Obviously, it really depends upon the solution. So if we had a solution that's more dynamic, we're probably going to reach for the actual single page application frameworks like React or Angular or Vue. But if we do marketing sites, or if we work for the client that's trying to build out their existing content strategy and have a bit of a more custom built solution, then we would start to look at some of the frameworks that do provide static generation. So it's really just kind of all over the map, and I think my answer is kind of all over the map right now. But it's Gatsby and Next have kind of reared their head, especially in my area of expertise, to be like sort of the major players, which you can work with any sort of content strategy, right? Or any sort of strategy in general, right? You have Gatsby, which is necessarily meant for static sites. You have Next, which is more of your traditional things that you used to see back in like the .NET, like CS HTML days, where you have you have content that's generating static pages. So those two in my area are probably the biggest things that I've been looking at. And honestly, Ken, to answer your question, getting back to it, the way that I started really learning about these is doing side projects and individual projects for friends, family, things of that nature.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like, how can you do a lot of that work if they've got the data already somewhere and you can just generate from the data?
Yeah,
contents, catalogs, and things like that, right? Someone exports a catalog of things they want to put online, and you could turn it into a spreadsheet, convert it to something else like JSON, and then zip it, right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
So let's do this methodically then. Let's start off with Gatsby. So we started off, you ran into Gatsby early on and you started using it. Well, my notes go away. So how did you run into Gatsby? Like what caused you to kind of search for it and stumble into it?
I think it was part of the React ecosystem. Us as engineers, we subscribe to these different, blog sites and things of that nature. And Medium really picked up a lot of steam too in the past 5 years. So maybe some articles on Medium, but Gatsby kind of reared its head as like, hey, you can build HTML sites or sites in HTML with React, and people are like, oh wow, that's great. If you ever tried to scale your own HTML files with your own CSS, and then using post facto DOM target manipulation with like jQuery or Vanilla.js or something like that, it's near impossible.
Yeah.
So the idea of creating that HTML using React is like, wow, that's going to save me a ton of time. I can use the patterns I'm using to create my apps, but I can also use those same patterns to create static sites. So when it first came up, Gatsby was like a static site generator. It created the HTML that you needed at build time to make your site, and it's built as lightning fast. There is no server to interact with. It's all static content. So that's where I ran into Gatsby for the first time.
Okay, so you ran into Gatsby. You were able to use it to generate your static site. am I correct in understanding that the basic querying mechanism is GraphQL for Gatsby?
Yes,
Okay.
Gatsby's entire fundamental paradigm is that you have just one big graph that you draw your data from at build time. And when you draw your data from there, you can insert your data dynamically into your content. It's built, and then it's stuck into the HTML files.
So now let's say you've got, a friend that you're building a website for. How did you approach getting the data in the right format for that? Did you, create schemas and run things in like a GraphQL server? Did you use a third-party open source thing, like or an online service? What did you end up using for some of that stuff?
So one of the big benefits about Gatsby is their plugin ecosystem. It's obviously an open source tool. You can create a plugin for it. So you don't necessarily have to go out and create your own nodes, create your own graphs to then filter into the Gatsby API to then get your content. So if you use a lot of these headless CMSs like Contentful and Prismic and all the other ones, those are just, I guess, some of the major players. They have an open source tool that someone has created at some point in time to access the data from there, right? So you go into those tools, exactly right here. So you can pretty much search anything you want.
Okay.
So search for Contentful or something like that, right? So,
of course, we try to find the right one.
Gatsby source Contentful. It's got 235,000 downloads.
That one, sucker right there. Yeah.
So this is the plugin ecosystem, right? It makes it very, very easy to use any of the existing major players in the content ecosystem, and then you can just say, all right, I'm going to use my classic npm install. I'm going to follow these 3 configuration points, and then I'm going to be off to the races, right? So then those nodes by themselves are created, and you have access to the content that you have inside the Gatsby GraphQL API.
Okay, so basically it will convert for build time. It will convert some source into something that will have a GraphQL graph. In this case, even if it was some other format, it's going to put it in a format that you can then query in a GraphQL format, so that's the lingua franca of this thing, is to get it going.
Exactly.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah. So let's say for instance that a content management solution doesn't have a GraphQL API, right? They have a traditional REST, REST solution. So what Gatsby allows you to do is call those endpoints for whatever you have. And then it gives you a couple of API points that you can take that content and filter it into the existing framework for the graph that Gatsby is expecting. And then the user or the developer has that already there. So the legwork has to be done inside the plugin. It's not necessarily like everything has to be GraphQL. You can get it from any source you want. But Gatsby's ultimate paradigm is every plugin, anything you do, anything you fetch data from should be fetched using the central GraphQL API.
Okay. And so now, in terms of theming and layout, you're completely open to doing whatever you want to do. I'm assuming, if you're used to doing your CSS and JS frameworks, you would use something like that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, more plugins. If you want to use a CSS and JS solution, you download let's use styled components for instance.
Right.
Something I intrinsically reach for every single time that I start a project.
I still love that thing. Yeah,
it's awesome, right?
Yeah.
It's nice because it's as close to the CSS spec as possible.
Right.
Not a lot of object notation and special happy things that go on in JSS. So you can use this, and then what Gatsby does at build time, or what the plugin does when Gatsby builds your solution, looks at all your CSS, finds the things it needs to insert in statically, and then it generates that CSS and sticks it at the top of the page or at the top of the document.
Very cool. Very cool. All right. So then,
again, massive tool ecosystem to completely remove all the mental load and overhead of what you previously would have to do,
Right. But one of the negatives, and I have a couple articles we can talk about briefly and share, but one of the knocks on Gatsby seems to be that it ends up being everything's its own little unicorn of plugin connections, right? That's kind of like WordPress too, right? I've suffered through WordPress because it works, and it's it keeps the shoemakers having to worry about having their own shoes out of the equation for our consulting firm. It works, it's good enough, it gets the content out there, but ultimately at some point it starts to kind of collapse on its own weight, right? So if you're working in Gatsby a lot, I'm assuming there's a lot of bespoke configurations to create for different customers.
Yeah, so I can give you a very specific example of how this really came back to bite me in the ass.
Okay.
It was so I needed to for a friend and just a family member is basically I needed to access some data from the Stripe API. So Stripe
Mm-hmm.
is just a way to process credit cards, right?
Yeah. Right.
And the Gatsby plugin allowed me to get everything except the new price implementation, and it wasn't going to be released since it's an open source tool for quite some time.
Mm-hmm.
So the plugin had everything except the thing that I needed. So I was like, all right, I have to go and try to figure out a way to get the data that I need into my Gatsby site. So the method that I went about going is I used, I think there was probably about 4 APIs in Gatsby's build process to actually eventually create the node. So I had to first get the data using REST. Second, I had to mold that data into the shape that I wanted. Third, I had to create a Gatsby node. Fourth, I had to iterate over that node to create multiple nodes to create a single node, which had a single, get single data, and then an all nodes, which had a bunch of edges of nodes. So I went through 6 or 7 steps to eventually get the data that I needed into the Gatsby GraphQL API, when really all I could have done is gone into the file, called the endpoint, and got the data that I needed. So
Right. Right.
it's great. So here's the beef that I've had with the entire abstraction, and this is kind of reared its head as you really get to use some of the more advanced concepts of the tool. It's everything from the build process is all abstracted out into Gatsby build process. So
Mm-hmm.
if you knew Webpack in the past, and you knew it tooth and nail, you knew loaders, you knew different ways that you could work with plugins and the different types of modes that you needed to set, so on and so forth. Gone, right? Now you
have
have
access to that.
new set of proprietary APIs, or not proprietary, but
Their
custom
own.
APIs that Gatsby has, like create node, on after create node, things of that nature, to
Mhm.
eventually get your data or get your build back in there, right? So it's good if, and I'm really gonna hang myself here, but it's good if you have the plugins that you need. You have the things that are already there for you, and it gets very, very fast, very, very quick, right?
Mm-hmm.
You add a couple of plugins, you configure it the way it does, you configure the way it says, and then boom, you have your site, right? But when you start to get in more advanced concepts, especially with interacting and integrating with other services that may or may not be a part of the plugin system, that's when it really has a problem, and that's when you have to do a lot of the manual legwork.
Right.
And it can be done, and it works just as much as they said it does. It's eloquent. You can pull in data from Google Sheets, combine it with some data from Stripe, put it into a single node, and you have combined data there. But again, doing that legwork is always a lot more than it really needed to be.
So I bring up that question because in researching this, and I played a little with Next.js in the past. We actually, 2 summers ago, I had a client that a week before my React training class said, "Do you mind if we do this on Next.js?" I'm like, "What is Next.js?" So I spent I'm like, "I don't know. I'll take a look and see if I can kind of translate it." It was easy to pick up because it was basically server-side rendered React, where whatever page you hit is already generated, and it starts a React app up to do the rest through an SPA. At least that's what I understood it to be at the time. So you've got your single page app, but you also have content that's generated on a server. So this article that Jared Palmer, who's the creator of React Router, I believe, or no, is it Formic? He's the Formic developer. Has a really good write-up of, he was using Gatsby for a lot of his projects, and then he ended up going to Next.js specifically because kind of I'm not really paraphrasing, I'm kind of making up a quote, but it's like the easy things are relatively easy, but the hard things are really hard. Right. So you run into these things where you've got to integrate data, and all of a sudden you got to take a plugin and put it on the OR. So you're dealing with operating through a plugin, fixing it for yourself. And if we scroll down, he has a whole discussion about what he had to do to deal with converting an RSS feed. He was doing a podcast. It's not in GraphQL. It's an XML, because RSS is an XML format that Apple invented, 20 years ago or whatever, 15 years ago. And he had to convert it to, so this is what this his plugin ended up doing was fetching an RSS feed in XML, and then converting it to JSON, plucking the episodes array off the JSON object, walk through every entry, tweak it with magic, then added each entry to Gatsby's GraphQL layer as an episode node, and blah, 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 blah. But then he had to do two more fetches because he had to get the show itself, which was a different fetch, and then some other piece of information. And so he's just like, this is painful, you know? And then when it blew up, it just said, yeah, I blew up somewhere around here.
Yeah, it's the error notification system is brutal. Again, that system or that notification system has been abstracted away from the original Webpack internals. So, you know, the errors that Webpack would throw, you don't know them anymore.
You just get like Gatsby node.js, right? Like it's the generated node file. Like, what do I do with this?
That's symptomatic of a framework, right? You do the things the framework says, you know.
Yeah.
And if I had another session right now, I could go into all the things that I don't like about Angular. Just because don't put me in a box, right?
I did that to you on purpose. Yeah. I must say that at full disclosure, I forced Drew to wrestle with Angular on the prior project just because I wanted to see him sweat, and he still didn't sweat. Yep. So yeah, so the client wanted that, but you know, it's the kind of thing where, you know, you're right. You get hooked into the framework, and the framework can leave you flat. Yeah. All right. So anyway, so you ran into for a project you're working on now, a reason to use this next framework we're talking about, which is Next.js. So let's talk a little bit about the difference here. So, you know, Next.js is another open source framework. What does it do?
So the big selling point of Next.js is that it's your traditional server-side rendering. So basically what that means is that when the client goes and requests a page, you're actually getting the full HTML page that is rendered on the server. So outside of Gatsby, what happens is Gatsby builds all of your files. Let's say that you have a home page, right? When you run Gatsby build, it'll build that page out and it'll stick it in your in the files for the website statically, right? When you use Next and you have dynamic content on your home page, Next will create that on the server and then it will send it to the client. So basically you have all of the I'd say the traditional means of what we used to develop with, where you would actually create HTML on the server and then send it to the client. So it's getting kind of back to the whole roots of you know, web development, web application development. But you have a lot of the benefits of working on the server, right? So you can choose if you want to do things dynamically, to do things statically. There's a lot more improvements that have come over the past couple of months. I'd probably say past year for Next than that have made it kind of like a better player than Gatsby. They're a more extensible player, I'd say.
Well, to that aim, right? You have access directly to the Webpack tool, right?
Yes. So Next's like big idea was, hey, you know, everyone up to this point has probably learned Webpack or fought with it in some form or fashion. Let's not create like these ridiculous abstractions over an existing tool. Let's, you know, provide some sort of hook-ins that you can actually create your own Webpack configs or your own Babel configs. That's a whole other thing if you're not using TypeScript. Let people do things the way that they have been doing for a while. If they weren't using Create React app, but at the same time, let's give them some APIs on the server side that can make their development experience a little bit better, and ultimately give you just a better client experience as well.
So am I correct in saying that when you download it, if you truly generated some content and it's pages you can hit and they're pre-rendered, you can also get a fully running React app on the client side once you hit a page that is components?
Exactly, yeah. So the two things that Gatsby and Next do the exact same way are, I'll say four things. I'm going to compare and contrast two things.
Yeah, go ahead.
They both use React to render your HTML, right? That's the biggest thing. That's the biggest selling point of both of these frameworks, and they are frameworks. The second thing is that if there is dynamic content on the page that the build system can't understand as static content, it will create JavaScript chunks for it. It'll create just random JavaScript chunks that you're used to seeing with Create React app. And it will insert those into the head of the document that it serves. And then when the document is loaded, it basically says, all right, I've rendered all the static content, and now I'm going to rehydrate the page using React. and then you can run the rest of the page in React. So it's kind of like a hybrid rendering strategy where you serve as much static content as you possibly can to get your first meaningful paint. And then based upon the next data, the data that you have that is relatively dynamic, React will be instantiated on the page, and then it allows you to run the rest of your React code as a traditional React app.
So does that include like other links? So for example, you create some links to a routed to page, right? It's not running React router, it's Next router, right?
Yeah, so each routing mechanism ties into how the framework decides that routing is going to work. With Gatsby, and the thing that we're using our existing client right now is we're using that sort of hybrid strategy where we're trying to render as much static content as possible first,
right,
i.e. pages, and then rehydrate the page with React. But where that kind of broke down is the fact that we require authentication on every single page. So most every single page right now is a dynamic page. So I lost my train of thought. Where was I going with that, Ken?
So we're talking about the oh man, so do I. First chink in the armor. No, so basically, the point being that you've got like React on the client side for the next style of doing things. You actually download a React component, but then you want to route somewhere else, which was where I was going.
Yeah, so when you route somewhere else, the framework understands whether you're going to an actual page or whether you're going to a dynamic route. And the dynamic route would be anything inside of React. So Gatsby's main strength is that it allows you to render all of your static content as possible. Let's say you have a marketing site paired with a application, sort of the same domain, not on a different subdomain. You can render all of your pages that you want as your marketing site, and then you can have a link that goes out to a dynamic portion of the application. And then from there, it's a traditional React application. Okay. Where Next gives you the same ability, but a lot of that intelligence isn't done at build time. The intelligence is done on the server. So you're still going to be getting a HTML page that is actually very, very fast and can be rehydrated with React. But you have the ability with Next to make that decision dynamically rather than saying, all right, well, I actually want this to be a little bit different. So I have to go back and rebuild my entire solution, deploy it on code build if you want, and then see that sort of change.
Right. Okay. So the other thing that I saw that was a big deal is that they don't really force you down a road for a lot of things. So for example, the querying mechanism could be anything you want, even node file APIs, right?
Absolutely.
That seems to be a huge advantage.
It really is. I mean, there's a big push, especially from the way that I engineer, is to co-locate certain topics and certain ideas, right? So we went from this whole division, especially when Redux was introduced, like you have to separate all your files by their concern, not necessarily by their feature, right? So now there's a push to pull everything back toward this group feature. So if you, instead of like making all the calls that you need in a separate place, let's say that you have a page that needs to be duplicated 500 times for 500 blog posts. Next allows you to do all of that data fetching, all of that rendering, and all of that, let's say, dynamic intelligence right in one file. So you don't have to have like 4 editors open at once, looking in 6 different places, trying to track exactly where things are going. So the beauty of that is that there's no magic sauce behind it. It's like you fetch your data you need for that page. You use some of the APIs that Next provides to either render your content in traditional SSR, whether you want to render your content statically, or whether you want to just use, like I said, the traditional SSR, and then you give the page to the client.
Gotcha. I'm actually throwing up something. This will be a bad move. For sure, it's going to be screwed up. But let's see here. We have there are a whole bunch of examples on their website of integrating with a bunch of different types of content types, right? So if there's a REST route that you want to integrate, right, there are samples for that. And if I remember correctly, let's see if I do this right. There's a method. Of course, I won't be able to find it now. I won't be able to find it now. Figures. But the method is there's a callback API, right? So just like all the other React features, there's like a method that you call in React to generate the dynamic content or the static content, I should say, as it's running through and doing the build, right? Like
Correct.
you implement a method like get something or other.
Yeah, everything with Next is get static props if you
Thank
want to
you.
render a static page.
Thank you for that.
Another one with Next is get initial props, which basically gets the initial data that you need to serve to the page. Another one is get server-side rendered props, and then so there's different APIs that Next provides you to be able to feed the data to the page or get the data or get the page to render a certain way.
Gotcha. Yeah, I was trying in real time to find something, which is always a failure.
Like doing that in public.
Yeah, I'm not afraid of that anymore. I've felt the pain and all the nerves are damaged, so it's okay now. Any other advantages do you think for using Next over something like Gatsby that you've found that are really useful?
Like two things. The first would be you can make a distinction on what content you want to load initially as part of a server-side rendering strategy, and then you can make the decision that you want to render some other stuff dynamically on the client. So let's say that you're rendering Google Maps, right? On the left-hand side, you could provide sort of like the overall summary, just some of the initial data points. You can render that on the server, right? So when the user goes there, that content will maybe let's say it'll take a half a second to render and be served to the client. But let's say the map actually is a little bit more intense. You don't necessarily want to stop the user from seeing the page or seeing the information about the map or seeing the information about the place that you searched. So we can tell the page to say, all right, when you get to this amount of data, you can render the page, and we'll let the map load in the background while the user is inspecting the left-hand side. So you can slice and dice however you want your page to render to get the fastest meaningful paint to the user, rather than it being an all or nothing approach with Gatsby. It's like at build time, you must know exactly what is going to be statically rendered or statically generated, and then the rest is all going to be dynamic. So Next gives you a lot of ability to kind of figure out exactly the way that you want your page to work and the way that you want your user to interact with the page and the speed. And then the second thing is that Next is becoming like a full stack framework, a full stack node framework. Their API system is built on Express, I believe. And you have the ability to co-locate your pages and write your actual API inside of Next.js. The mechanisms in which you do that too are, if you're familiar with Next.js, you go into the source directory. Next to your pages directory, you create an API, or inside of your pages directory, you create an API directory. And then there, Next.js knows that any time I call something on the same domain with /API, I'm going to go to the file system routing and I'm going to look for the API methods inside of that directory.
Very cool.
Very, very cool, right? So when you deploy Next, you're actually deploying it because you have server-side rendering. The next step is say, all right, well, my API may as well be Node, may as well be like monolithic to this application. So why not put that in there, right? Now, the added benefit on top of that too is that you have the ability, if you deploy your application to Versal's hosting system, I think for teams it's like $20 a month.
Oh, that's not bad. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, yeah, it's pretty good, right? Yeah. And dynamic CDN delivery, all that kind of stuff. Edge network delivery, anything that you possibly see with like Netlify or Cloudflare or any of the other like network edge sites. Versal does this specifically for Next.js. But when you deploy your APIs, you can actually deploy them. And if you create your site statically, it will take every function that you have inside of your API file and create it to a serverless function. So from there, if you decide that you create an API next to a statically generated site, you have the ability to then call different API endpoints using the serverless functions, because there is no, said server, right? You can do all that stuff at build time. So there's a lot of extensibility using a lot of the different parts of Next.js that Gatsby doesn't provide, but Gatsby does, or it is a very, very elegant solution for, I think, getting up very, very fast, getting up very, very quick, and some of your more simple use cases for plugins and things like that that already exist.
This is going to come out of left field, but is there a migration path for people who have built on Gatsby, given that there's some React to it, or is it completely gut everything and start again? If you were converting it to Next.
So funny you should ask, because we're right
That's why I'm asking.
Next to that one up, but right in the middle of that migration, and it's not as bad as you would think. You have to replace, and since we're using TypeScript, the types are going to change. Some of the mechanisms of the page types for Gatsby are different than the mechanisms of the types of pages for Next.
Oh, and to be clear, so you can do TypeScript with Gatsby as well?
Correct, yeah,
okay.
But
all right.
Plugin, you have to enable it yourself.
Of course, yes,
like
everything.
Yeah, but with Next, when you have a TypeScript file, a tsconfig, it automatically recognizes that, and that's the beauty of it. If you have a Webpack config, it recognizes that. If you have a Babel config, it recognizes that. So again, when a lot of the existing tools out there recommend you put these configuration files in the root of the directory, Next file is that convention too.
Okay, very cool.
So yeah, so the migration path in itself, you're dealing probably with different types. Because they have opinionated ways on their directory structure, you are going to be putting your files in a different manner, but it's a matter of just moving directories.
Just shuffling things around a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, Next uses file system routing, and Gatsby also, it doesn't use file system routing, but the pages that you put inside the pages directory are rendered exactly as they are. Where there's a couple of different, if you want let's say you want like a blog / whatever the slug of that blog is, Next requires you put it in the semantics that they have, which is a file name with brackets around it, which kind of make the idea of the file name being dynamic. So outside of the routing, outside of the sort of directory shuffling, and then outside of the linking too, they both provide their linking mechanisms. Like if you click on a link on a page, you have to click on it brings you to whatever the framework decides is the link. So there's not too many semantics. I mean, at the end of the day, it's React. And if you build your React application correctly, you should have architected your features away from the pages.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Ostensibly, all you're doing is moving pages. And when you do separate your concerns like that, you're basically delegating your pages the responsibility of just rendering a typical React feature rather than putting all of your features inside of the page. If you architect that correctly, it's maybe a day or two task for a mid-application. If you're dealing with a large legacy application or a large legacy site, then it's
whatever it is. Yeah, right.
Yeah. It grows linearly without linearly.
What you said.
Yeah, exactly.
I have the same problem.
It grows linearly with how many instances of a page that you have, or how many instances of a route or something of that nature. But you'll find that as you start to pull these things out, let's say that you have 40 pages of something, and then you have another page that is your blog template, and then that generates 500 pages. You'll see that instead of having to provide all 40 pages plus 500 with the same GraphQL API, you can co-locate your concerns, and then that page is only concerned with the blog post that you have. So it's, as you start to do it, you feel a lot better about yourself, where you can delete a lot of like really large, forced configuration files. So
yeah, that feels really good when you can get rid of junk that you just had to do for a framework and it just works the other way.
Yeah.
Oh, I wanted to clear up a couple things. So Angular does have server-side rendering. I just didn't remember the name of the tool. It's called Angular Universal. So they do, but also you mentioned Vue, and that's true. Vue is creating an SSR version of itself too. So, if you were a Vue developer and you were looking for the same kind of feature from Vue, you could look into what they're doing as well.
Yeah.
Server-side rendering certainly is one useful thing to take a look at.
Yeah, I think the really interesting thing about React, though, is, Vue is a framework, Angular is a framework, right? They already have these conventions on things that you should be putting inside of the DOM to render certain things, so on and so forth, right?
Right.
When it comes down to it, React is ultimately a library. So there could be anybody out there interfacing that library and putting it into their own framework. So like I said before, Gatsby's a framework. You do things a certain way with them, but then you have Next.js, which serves a pretty similar purpose, but but still has a lot of other like more extensible features, and it's using React in their own way, right? So
Yep.
ultimately, you're building a React application, but depending upon the use case you have, you can use different frameworks, and that I think is a really like it's a really nice thing to have choice, because
Yeah. What if you have, and this is another completely out of left field thing. You've got React developers who subscribe to React with some sort of state store, and let's say they used Redux, and they want to add some, server-side rendering to those applications. Is it possible to take an almost completely fully fledged React application with the router and Redux and add Next.js features to it, or something like that? Or are you basically kind of having to re-architect a lot of that stuff?
I don't think you really would have to re-architect a lot of stuff. I haven't done that before. I haven't used Redux in like 2 years.
Yeah, it's a thought experiment more than anything else for me.
Yeah, I'd have to check into the way that they actually would recommend it. But like the community goes, it's probably already documented. It's probably already been done so many times, and I'm sure Next has a very opinionated way on how you would manage Redux, right?
Yeah, probably. Okay. All right, cool. Are there any other tools besides Next and Gatsby that are on your radar for this kind of process?
Probably. I
You're
don't
in the
know if
thick of
I
it with
would.
Next right now. Yeah.
Yeah, there's not enough hours in the day to research the entire ecosystem.
It's very true.
Most of the things that I've seen recently coming out have been more on the content side.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Next and Gatsby have kind of been in this. I call it like the HD DVD, like Blu-ray fight. Am I dating myself right now? I don't know.
I think so. Yeah.
Uh,
Welcome to the
but
group.
yeah, you have these two like similar concepts competing for sort of there are two major players competing for the market cap, right?
Mm-hmm.
But on the content side, it's kind of free form. So you have serverless content management. You
Yeah.
have let's call it hosted content management. Things like your Contentful, your Prismix, I think Webiny is maybe Webiny is another site. I can't remember, but
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
anything derivation of Contentful is kind of like your more content experience. So there's a massive explosion going on as far as like that goes, right? You can do anything you want with your. I mean, even WordPress has their own API now. So all right, you don't want to use WordPress, you can still use WordPress to host your data, but you can use whatever framework you want because it's a headless CMS too.
Right.
So I see a lot more going on in that area than I necessarily do in the rendering tools or the frameworks around React.
One other note to make is that if you are generating content, you have to schedule these generations to happen in some way, shape, or form, right? So what are some of the tips that you might have for people that are managing that?
Well, your biggest thing, let's say that you're using Gatsby, right? And you have someone creates a new blog post. I mean, this is such a canned example; it's ridiculous.
It's all
Um,
right. I'll
so
take
I
it.
create a new blog post, but I have a static site. And let's say I'm a content manager. I'm like, why is my site not rendering? Why am I not seeing my blog post? Well, it's because your solution hasn't built yet, right? It hasn't rebuilt because there's new content there. A lot of the major players now all have webhooks. And if you go to any modern I'm gonna go out of the box right now. I know we're really heavily invested in AWS, and we can do all the custom configuration we want.
Yeah,
But
but
let's say,
let's put that aside. Yeah.
let's go beyond that.
Hmm.
Netlify's, your renders, your Versals, your trying to think of some more.
Now is another one I've heard of.
Now basically is synonymous with Versal. That's what they're
Interesting. That's where it came from. Okay. Yeah.
So yeah, like those solutions say, all right, if you want to redeploy your build or redo your build, here's the webhook that you call. So when in your content systems, you can basically say, when I change my content, I want you to call this specific endpoint, and that'll retrigger a build. So a lot of the ways that you would retrigger builds is dynamically through webhooks. That's kind of the only way. It's more of like an not industry standard, but more of an accepted standard when you kind of get to these tools.
Yeah, it's like with a lot of CI tools, for example. That's your webhook triggers everything. So it's similar. Yeah. So instead of scheduling something with cron, you'd make sure that whenever the content's been updated, you trigger a generation of the site, and then hopefully have a good notification system for when that doesn't work, so you can figure out what blew up and keep the old site there, I would guess.
Yep, typical emails,
Typical
text
CI.
messages. Yeah,
Right.
exactly. Typical CI.
Okay, cool. This has been great. I really appreciate you spending the time on this with us. This has been really fascinating. I think a lot of people are interested in this, and it's good to hear someone who's been working with it for a while to get a feel for like what kind of issues you run into and the types of tools you use. So really
Yeah,
appreciate it, Drew.
of course. I mean, when it comes down to it, I would completely suggest using a React framework. Pick which.
No, you?
So I think an interesting thing to talk about too is that you can still do your traditional single page application with a Create React app, but where it really breaks down is when you want to go outside the bounds and doing your own things.
Yeah.
The Create React app locks everything down, everything from the version of TypeScript that you use to what things that you can or can't add. If you want to upgrade your ESLint plugin, you can't. You have to check your app and you manage everything by yourself.
Right.
Whereas Gatsby and Next, they offer two different varying approaches on how you interact with the build system, but they do take care of the builds for you, but they give you a little bit more room to breathe if you do want to edit certain things and adjust certain things and tweak certain things. So, ultimately, and I've done this before, don't build your own Webpack config. Don't create your entire build system.
Right.
Don't start from nothing. It's
been done before.
Yeah, like
by better people than you doing it quickly on your own.
Exactly. So these companies are here for a reason. These tools are here for a reason because they found best practices in doing this stuff. Always use a build system. Always use a framework because it doesn't really. It's not worth your time, unless you want to deep dive and understand, how your loaders need to be stacked inverse rather than in the order that you would expect, right? That'll burn you too.
And it does seem like if you're very tied to dynamicism, really, Next gives you a lot more features and options. And if you need to do things that are, tweaking things during build time, you've got the Webpack configuration right there to work with. So like of the two of them, if one's more standard content only that you're generating, Gatsby seems to be more what you would look at, and Next is better for, if you have Ajax calls to make or files to sip or anything like that. It just seems like a more feature-rich thing. But the good news is you're still using React in both cases. So get good at React. There's a lot of tools out there that really use it to their advantage.
Yeah, I mean, all the same fundamentals come down to React. You need to worry about what components are re-rendering. You need to worry about what types of props you're passing. Are you using callbacks? Are you using the effects properly? Like all the same paradigms and rules and tools of React still apply. So getting good at React, you're ultimately going to get good at one of these solutions too.
And get good at React with TypeScript, because then you've got typing and you're not going to make as many mistakes.
don't ever use JavaScript again.
I love what TypeScript has done. I mean, it can be a little obtuse at first to pick up, but the thing is, it's a really powerful little compile time language. It's really useful. So, all right, man. Thank you so much. Yeah.
I'm happy to talk about it too. One thing I will admit is that I believe, and we're just getting into it right now, the support and idea of server-side rendering for progressive web apps is a little bit more pure on the Next.js side than it is on the Gatsby side.
Is it? Okay. Good to know. All right, great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ken. Appreciate it. Thanks for
Take care.
having me.
All right.